Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Richard Waugh from Zycus, your host for this morning's session. And our topic for today is CPO Moneyball, how analytics are altering procurement's playbook. We're glad to have you for this session today. Again, I'm your host. I'm VP of Corporate Development at Zycus, we'll be pleased to be joined today by a real expert in the field whom I'm going to lean heavily on as we go through some of these advanced metrics and analytics that are driving procurement forward. Pleased to be joined by Paul Sasko, who's the Senior Director of Supply Chain Management at Curtiss-Wright. And he's had a long, extensive background across operations roles as well as supply chain at Westinghouse Curtiss-Wright. He's currently chartered with bringing the benefits of centralized procurement in a decentralized business model by applying strategic sourcing methods. Paul holds a BSMET from the University of Pittsburgh in Johnstown and a BSME from the University of Pittsburgh, and has been a longstanding member of the ISM organization in Pittsburgh as well. Welcome today, Paul. So, just as we get into the session today, I just wanted to give you a little bit of contextual background on Zycus. We are a software provider. We have an integrated suite of source-to-pay modules that span both strategic and operational aspects of procurement, things like spend analytics, e-sourcing, contract and supplier management, procure-to-pay, as well as savings tracking, financial savings management. So not going to dwell on the tools today, except to the extent that these more advanced, best-in-class or best-of-breed type tools can really lend themselves to the advanced analytics that we're going to talk about today and some of the best practices that can be applied to use those insights from the tools, from the analytics, to drive your procurement performance forward. So the genesis for the theme today, those of you who have read the book, Moneyball by Michael Lewis, also wrote The Big Short, maybe another topic for another day. But if you didn't read the book, maybe you saw the movie with Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill. And the analogy that we're drawing here is baseball, for instance, has been applying very sophisticated and advanced analytics to kind of change the game and really give an edge to those teams that can leverage the data for better decision making. So a couple of quotes from the movie here. The Brad Pitt character, for example, is Billy Beane, the general manager of the Oakland A's, who says, "We're card counters at the blackjack table, and we're going to turn the odds on the casino. So how do I use the insights from the analytics to really gain a competitive advantage?" And one of his key sabermetricians, if you will, the analytics experts played by Jonah Hill, character Peter Brand, really talks about your goal shouldn't be to buy players, it's to buy wins. To get wins, you need to buy runs. So hopefully today we'll give you some insights and best practices on how to buy runs. That's going to help you put wins on the board for your procurement organization. So keeping with this baseball motif, our agenda for today is divided into innings. So we'll go through first inning, we'll talk about spend analytics. We'll talk about, in the second inning, speed, cycle time metrics that really measure your operational efficiency. The third inning, sourcing, how to put more spend under management, actively sourced, increase the throughput, drive higher savings, which segues right into the fourth inning here. How do you measure and track those savings? Fifth inning, contracting. If you're going to get the savings, the contracting is the method for ensuring compliance and avoiding contract leakage, having those savings slip away. Sixth inning, we'll talk about suppliers, how critical they are to your business, how to strategically assess your supply base. Seventh inning, we'll look at the operational aspects of procurement and procure-to-pay. And just like in a baseball game, we'll have a seventh inning stretch, which will be our opportunity to poll our audience today to get your perspectives on how analytics are being applied to your business. We'll have a couple of those poll questions. In the eighth inning, we'll look at your roster. As you look down the bench, Where have you applied your supply management resources? What are some of the benchmarks and best practices in that area? In the ninth inning, we'll wrap it up with a look at some additional performance metrics. So we're going to look at a variety of metrics throughout, but maybe look at how others view your organization's performance, whether those are internal stakeholders or external suppliers. And as we go into extra innings, if you will, that will be your opportunity for Q&A. Feel free to ask Paul or myself any questions that arise as we go throughout the content today that you may have about how analytics are being applied in the field of procurement. So I want to start off the first inning. Logical starting point is spend under management. It's probably the most frequently used metric by most organizations, and interesting that when you look at some benchmarks across industries, there seems to be a wide disparity between what's being achieved by the best of the best-in-class organizations at 90% spend under management, and average performance being only slightly better than half of total spend. So you see 53% here in data from Ardent Partners benchmarking report from last year, CPO Rising 2015. So spend under management is a frequently used metric as a starting point for how effective your procurement organization is in either directly controlling or influencing the total spend. Sometimes the metric may be calculated slightly differently, so I thought it was important to share sort of a definition here. The one we're using is that we're talking about spend that's actively sourced or managed directly by procurement in the proportion to total spend exclusive of non-discretionary. So we're excluding things like taxes or charitable donations that really can't be influenced by the sourcing. You don't have an opportunity to negotiate those rates. In some cases, that may include utilities, for example. But once you look at true discretionary spend, the best-in-class organizations are getting to a very high level, 90% overall. So a couple of caveats here. Certainly, just having spend under management doesn't mean that you've achieved the savings, but it means that you've got accountability. The other one is 90% is a very realistic target for best-in-class, but 100% may not be attainable or even desirable, because going much beyond that, you're going to get into some of those really tail spend categories that may not really justify doing that level of assignment or allocation of that responsibility to a category manager or sourcing professional. So, and the other caveat here is the relevant benchmarks really vary widely from one industry to the next. So, for instance, you see a representative sampling from some CAPS research, the Center for Advanced Purchasing Studies, where the aerospace and defense, the industry, Paul, that you're in, is really the highest amongst this group, 93%, so above the best-in-class benchmark that applies across all industries, whereas an industry like financial services has sort of less of an historical tradition of centralized procurement control over spending. So my first opportunity to ask the expert here, Paul, to get your perspectives on spend under management and maybe some of the unique aspects, whether they're regulatory or compliance in aerospace and defense, that really lend themselves to a very high degree of spend under management, and then maybe to comment on how does a tool, an analytics capability like spend analysis, help you place and scrutinize more spend under management?
Well, great questions. And first, you're right, because we're in an aerospace and defense, and not only that, a nuclear environment with our customers. It's a very highly regulated, highly audited industry. So most of our spend does fall under management. with the rare exception probably in some of our indirect spend. And we have a lot of our work in corporate contracts is done in that indirect space. So how do we use the spend analytics to get more spend under management is we'll look for what we call that contract leakage. In other words, spend that's going around those contracts. And because of spend analytics, we can find out where that is, and then we can assess why it is. And normally what we do is we look at what our cause is, not what any other cause is, because we can impact what our involvement is in it. So we look at two things. Normally when we find spend that's leaking from a contract through our spend analytics, we try to find out have we met the needs of the business unit where the leakage is taking place. And if we haven't, now we know that we haven't, and we can try to address that by improving the contract. The other thing is awareness. So in our environment, we may not have communicated the contract appropriately. So it gives us an opportunity to find out that that's the case and do a better job with our advertising campaign of where these contracts lie.
Great perspective, Paul, and I think you've kind of gone beyond. It's not enough that a category manager or sourcing professional has been assigned to the category, which is sort of often the starting point for how folks calculate spend under management, but you're creating that linkage to actual compliance as well.
Correct.
So that's really critical, and that's going to be where the savings show up. And this topic of spend, our first inning is going to be a longer first inning because it's so foundational. We're going to drill into it a little bit more. And one of the things I neglected to mention, as questions occur to you, feel free to type those into the Q&A chat box. And I do have one at this point. So the question was, what about contracts that are not due to be negotiated this year? Would they still be captured under spend under management? Great question, and really the answer is yes, because to meet this test, this definition, it doesn't necessarily mean that the contracts are going to be in a negotiation cycle in the current year, but that there is a category manager or sourcing professional who's actively monitoring and controlling that category. But hold that thought for a second, because we are going to talk about how you transition from spend under management to how much of that spend are you actively sourcing, in fact, on an annual basis. So obviously that percentage is not as high, but spoiler alert, the best in class are actively sourcing on an annual basis, a much higher percentage of that spend under management than the average performers overall. So as I said, we're going to continue looking at spend analytics a little more deeply, because as we said, I think this is really foundational to your competitiveness. And look at, it's not enough to be able to aggregate spend into very, very large buckets like the product segment or family. The best performers are, in fact, able to get down to a very granular level of spend visibility. So, for instance, using a standard taxonomy like UNSPSC, that means the 3- and 4-digit class and commodity. So really being able to get down to not just that it's IT hardware, but it's the actual item level, meaning that how much am I spending on notebook computers, just as an example. And here you see a couple of graphs. One on the left side really looks at that stratification of the multiple levels, and of course the best performers, according to some research from Gartner, are able to classify 95% of their spend at the more granular class or commodity, the 3- or 4-digit level. So that's one of the targets, one of the goalposts here. The other thing the graph on the right shows, again from Gartner, is that top performers are refreshing those spend analytics more frequently than others. So, in times past, historically, especially with very manual efforts, having to compile data using multiple spreadsheets and those kinds of tools, it's been a Herculean effort to produce a spend analysis, and therefore organizations might do it once a year or even less frequently. But, really the advancement here, the change is with automated spend analysis tools, it's possible to get very frequent refreshes, quarterly, monthly, even weekly in some cases. And again, a correlation to how the top performers are getting not only more granular visibility, but more frequent refreshes that data to spot trends as they arise. Just as you say, Paul, for example, if you got a situation of non-compliance, you don't want to find out about that a year from now. You want to know this month, this quarter perhaps, so that you can take remedial action here. The other thing that we've noted here is there's a clear payoff from better spend analysis. So Ardent Partners research shows that those enterprises that are leveraging spend analysis into sourcing projects are achieving a much higher level of savings per project, somewhere between 24 and 41%. So lots of good arguments for doing spend analytics. One last data point here before I, again, ask you to comment, Paul, is that with Hackett Group's data shown here, top performers have twice as much spend visibility at a line item, supplier, and category level, so 73% as compared to 38%. So again, an argument that says there's a clear correlation between better spend visibility and better performance for the organization. So questions for you, Paul. How does spend visibility enable your performance achievement to be enhanced for your organization, and exactly how are you using spend analytics? How do individual category managers or sourcing managers interact with these tools?
Well, the first comment I'll make is that when we got our first spend visibility tool, I was asked by one of our P&L leaders, how much is this thing going to save me, right? They want to understand the return on the investment. And I always try to remind people that it's a tool. It doesn't save you money. You have to keep it sharp, and you have to utilize that tool. And in our environment, it's critical because our company has grown predominantly through acquisition, so we have a very disparate ERP environment that we work in. There's no common part numbers. There's not a common taxonomy with our spend. So the only way we can really strategically source or understand what our spend is and where to attack is to have some method to do these analytics. And without spend visibility, we really would be flying this plane blind. So we use it to populate a project funnel. We take the spend cube, and when I refer to a spend cube, I'm talking about the 3 different dimensions that are in there. So it's the business units that are doing the spend, who they're doing the spend with, what category that spend is, and then ultimately how much spend. And we try to create target categories with that. So how's that analysis used? When we build this funnel, we actually use it 2 different ways. So we see opportunities in there, and we try to assess the ease of implementation. First of all, how many business units do we impact? So what is the imprint that we can make upon the company with a business project through this tool? And then sometimes we get a request from a business unit saying, we'd like you to source a category with us or for us. And we use the tool to go out there and first validate that spend is rich enough, high enough that it's worthwhile. And then we try to find other business units within Curtiss-Wright that can also participate and make this a supplier rationalization project or a bigger opportunity for our supply base to further increase their appetite to want to participate and drive increased savings for the business. So that's basically how we leverage this tool at Curtiss-Wright.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. And some more questions coming in on the chat log on the topic of spend. So the first one, what is meant by refreshing spend? Is it checking for correctly categorized spend? Certainly it is about checking for correctly categorized spend, and it's the interval, the cadence at which you refresh that spend data. And the reason for needing to do the refreshing of spend on a frequent basis, a regular cadence, is first of all that no one's business is purely static. So the advanced spend analytics tools utilize an artificial intelligence technology, a machine learning technology that's able to build various algorithms that pick up the data in your transactional activity and know how to map that to the correct categories. Now, since your business is not static, you may be introducing new suppliers that or buying new products or services that need to be, updated in that taxonomy. So that's one reason for a refresh. The other is just to have the latest spend activity to get the insights for things like negotiating volume leverage purchases, so you know your demand profiles have changed or they fluctuate from month to month or quarter to quarter. So you got the most current, accurate, and up-to-date information there. And you can also keep tabs on, just as Paul mentioned, those incidences of noncompliance before that gets out of hand. So that was the question on refreshing spend. How do you define spend is the other question here. Actually paid, or invoices booked in P&L accounts or PO value. It is actually paid, but the way this is done is to actually utilize all manner of transactional information. So PO activity is some of the most reliable in that it usually provides the most detailed item descriptions for purposes of categorization, but on a monthly or quarterly basis as you do the refreshes, it would be based on actual spend and not committed spend. So if you just raised a PO and you haven't actually paid the invoice yet, it wouldn't yet be actual spend. It would only be committed spend at that point. So lots to talk about in spend analytics, of course. Thought it might be helpful to sort of give you a quick demonstration for how these tools work. I mentioned it's an artificial intelligence and a machine learning algorithm, all of which sounds fairly complex, but of course generates much higher accuracy. It can be produced much faster, so the turnaround time on the refreshes is much more timely, and can accommodate much more data because of the machine learning approach, so it's higher throughput. And the challenge, I'm going to do a little bit of a before and after picture for you here. It's probably familiar to many of your organizations that you've got transactional spend across multiple business unit or plant locations. If you're a global business, that may be in different countries, even in different languages. And so if you look at the item descriptions, then I have maybe in different languages, number one. They may be incomplete or cryptic descriptions or missing descriptions altogether. And really the power of an artificial intelligence-based tool for doing this is to be able to create those algorithms, pick up different clues in the data, some combination of item description and supplier name and GL code or material group. And the ultimate objective is how do I take all these what seem to be very disparate transactions and apply a common taxonomy like a UNSPSC or maybe a hybrid taxonomy that combines a standard like UNSPSC with a proprietary or industry-specific taxonomy. But the ultimate goal, how do I get down to a granular level of visibility to what the spending actually is? So if we took this data example, of course, the challenge here, I mentioned them, disparate systems, different GL codes, maybe different languages and different classification standards, and the challenge is, of course, garbage in, garbage out. But when I put this through an AI-based, artificial intelligence-based machine learning method of categorizing the spend and pick up on all those different cues, in this example here, these are all, in fact, the same item. They're really all notebook computers described differently, perhaps from different manufacturers or distributors, but all then ultimately categorized in the same category code. And the real payoff for strategic sourcing is now I've got an accurate view at a very granular level of exactly what's being purchased so that I can leverage that in my strategic sourcing negotiations. So I've got the advantage of quality data output and real accurate and timely spend analytics that I can drive savings from. So that's the spend inning. I want to transition now in the second inning. I want to talk about speed across the source-to-pay cycle. And on the front end of that process, some of the challenges are if you're looking at sourcing and contracting cycles, those can be inherently longer processes. And of course, the longer those extend, the further in the future those savings that would accrue from those negotiated contracts would defer. So the idea, of course, is how do I shrink those cycle times? And you know, many of the top performers, of course, are paying close attention to what is their operational efficiency across the source-to-pay continuum. So starting with the sourcing cycle, at Zycus we did our own benchmarking study. It's called the Pulse of Procurement. The new one is just being published right now for 2016. But we contrasted sourcing cycle times, typical benchmark for complex and basic events. So the more complex events, you know, for complex services or engineered parts and those kinds of things are longer cycles. You know, those are extending about 3.5 months on average, whereas a basic event, your 3 bids and a buy might be completed in about 1.5 months. Of course, the goal is how do I shrink that cycle time overall and drive greater throughput. The negotiation, of course, is not the end of that process. Now I'm going to contracting. So I need to draft the agreement. I need to have it routed through the approval workflow of my legal group and other business owners. I'm going to have the sort of the back and forth negotiation around T's and C's with the suppliers. So, you know, not that big a disparity, quite frankly, in this data from the Aberdeen group of sort of what best-in-class achievement has been in about 40 days versus 49 days for everyone else. So maybe opportunity to pull that in and make it faster because, again, the longer it takes to get the contract, the longer those savings are pushed out into the future. And then once you get those suppliers on board and on contract, the key is to get them transactional now. So getting them onboarded, for instance, to enable them to receive a PO or to be able to deliver you an e-invoice back. So some data from the Hackett Group look at how long does it take per supplier to onboard them and enable them for e-invoicing. And it's not that intensive an effort from an applied time, about 17 hours, but 16 days elapsed. So you need to account for that to the point where you actually have them on board and are fully enabled for the end-to-end purchase-to-pay process. And then once they can send you an invoice, your ability to have that invoice routed through your internal approval cycle is going to be important as well, not only to ensuring on-time payments to your suppliers, but also to maximize cash discount opportunities. So, for example, those payment terms may often be something like 2% 10, net 30, 2% discount for payment within 10 days. Well, only the best in class, according to Ardent Partners' e-payables report, are within that lead time at about a little less than 4 days for the invoice approval cycle. So everybody else who's at an average of about 17 days wouldn't really be in a position to take full advantage of prompt payment discounts. So speed, cycle time, operational efficiency, another key area where more and more organizations are looking at how do I get the systems in place to produce the analytics so that I can track and monitor process efficiency and performance across the source-to-pay continuum. So let's delve into sourcing in inning number 3 a little bit more. And we've already talked about the link between spend analytics and sourcing. Better insights equals more savings. And here, the goal in sourcing is how do I touch that spend more frequently? How do I source more of it on an annual basis? And also by applying e-sourcing tools, can I get incremental savings? So a couple of different data points here. Spend source, this comes from Ardent Partners, best in class are actually sourcing on an annual basis 62% of the spend. So again, we said best in class spend under management is about 90%, and about those best in class companies therefore are actively sourcing about 2/3 of the spend under management on an annual basis. So more frequently to take advantage of changing market dynamics to ensure you're always getting the best market price. And not only that, by applying e-sourcing tools, they're getting about 1 point in incremental savings versus, let's say, traditional standard sourcing projects, RFIs, RFPs. By bringing that online, they're doing a better job of optimization using the analytics to identify better savings. Final data point I'll share with you on sourcing here comes from the Aberdeen group that really shows from a throughput standpoint, best in class are really knocking the ball out of the park here, if you'll excuse the baseball metaphor again. About 2,000 events, e-sourcing events on an annual basis, almost 4 times as many as the average performer. So when we look at this area, in the third inning here, Paul, for sourcing. As you look at your organization, how do you decide which categories to source, and what techniques or best practices have you adopted to try to increase your sourcing throughput?
Well, first, we take a look at the spend analytics. So we're trying to take that spend cube and slice it a few different ways, and we're looking for where we can impact multiple business units. And within that spend, we're looking at the size of it. So we want to make sure that we're making an investment that will give us an appropriate return. But I think it's really important to do something that's a little more qualitative and look at what is the ease of the engagement. So if you look at the category that you're about to source, it can range from probably the easiest being COTS, and it depends on what commercial off-the-shelf product you're trying to buy, all the way out to something that's very highly engineered. So you want to start, my opinion is that we found if you start with something easier, you gain that engagement with the team so they can get that taste of winning. And it's just like with baseball. Once you get on a roll, teams get on that, they get in a groove, they get that momentum. Your team can do the exact same thing, and you can go after those harder, more difficult categories with a lot more confidence. So we try to build that momentum that way. And then what we ended up doing to try to get that throughput, back to the speed question in the second inning, is we try to leverage online tools. So we're working across an enterprise that has business units in multiple locations, so we're working remote. And we try to take advantage of putting the products that we're going to source into one tool. The advantage of that is when the suppliers are actually filling out the RFP, they're doing it in a standard format. We don't have to manipulate the data into one format to do analytics once it's received. And if we really do it, that greatly reduces the time, by the way. And if we do it right with the right tool, there can actually be analytics built into the tool where you can pick strategies. For instance, cherry pick, give me the best price just line by line. Give me a supplier rationalization strategy. I only want to have 2 suppliers, or I only want to have 3 suppliers. What is the best combination of those 2 or 3 suppliers to get me the greatest savings? And then in those occasions where we have a category that lends itself well to reverse auction, and when I say lends itself well, it's something that they can dynamically bid. So it's like eBay in reverse. We're putting something up there we want to buy, and people over time are actually putting their prices in and seeing where they align in a competitive nature. The results are available the quickest because at the conclusion of that auction, you have all the data right there. So those have been the approaches that we've tried to leverage technology to help us increase our throughput, our sourcing throughput.
Yeah, great perspective, Paul. You're really talking about the power of the analytics to optimize and really go beyond what any human brain could fathom in terms of the number of different variables and so on. So if I could run multiple what-if scenarios on a single bidding event and have the analytics give me the insights to say what are my best options and do that quickly, then that's how you gain that incremental savings that you can realize by applying some of these advanced techniques. So great insights and best practices there. We'll talk then, so the goal of the sourcing is to identify savings. And I wanted to delve into the savings aspect a little bit more deeply here in the fourth inning, if you will. So we talked about how savings can be maximized on a per event basis by using e-sourcing tools. This benchmark looks at savings in the aggregate. And not a surprise, once again, best-in-class companies are in total or in aggregate getting better savings, almost 7% compared to about 6% for all others. The other data point that's interesting to me as well, this one comes from a study done by ISM and Spend Matters, looked at how savings actually degrade the later the sourcing procurement function is brought into the process. So for instance, if sourcing is involved right up front at the initial requirements definition, before the cost is almost designed in based on the spec, there's much greater opportunity to influence potential savings, so about 9% at that stage. And then ultimately, if sourcing and procurement is only brought in at the end when it's time to actually negotiate the contract, a third of those savings have leaked away. You're down to about 6%. So on this topic, I'd be interested, Paul, to get your perspective. How do you measure savings, and does it include both cost reduction and cost avoidance. And on this topic of early sourcing involvement that this graph demonstrates, how important is that, and what can be done to increase and give sourcing more times at bat, if you will, by being engaged early with the business?
Well, first, on the topic of cost savings and how it's measured, I'm sure there's a myriad of ways across different businesses how this is done. For us at Curtiss-Wright, this is a direct financial measure. We're really looking at how do we impact the bottom line for a product line or for a project. So if it's more of a volume project where we have standard costs that are built into the price of the product, we're constantly comparing the price paid against what was built into that standard cost. So if we're actually giving ourselves a detriment if we end up paying more than what was built into that cost. So it's a netted out cost savings. If it's a project and there's allocations based on what was supposed to go into that project by item being bought, we're doing the same type of comparison. So it's definitely a hard savings bottom line approach. In the case of soft savings, it is something we drive to achieve, but we don't heavily measure it because we can't readily see the bottom line impact to it. So we're focusing in that avoidance topic. We're talking about total cost of ownership. So that's how we're measuring it. So if the avoidance can be built into that total cost of ownership, then yes, it's calculated. If we can't see it directly impact the project, then it's kept but not added to our metric. And to the question about early involvement, I think that's critical. So sourcing early involvement is really critical. I believe in speaking to a supplier in one voice. So if a lot of the technical discussions are being done prior to sourcing involvement, sometimes you have very subconsciously backdoor selling taking place. So the people at the supplier's end, they're sales folks and they're trained. They know how to get certain critical information to understand where they stand. Supply management involvement can help negate a lot of that early on. And I'm also a big believer in the case of new product development that you do concurrent engineering with your supplier, with your buyer involved, so that they can understand how do we keep the price of this product at its target so that we don't increase the cost to the industry and price ourselves out. So how do we do this? My suggestions, what I've seen work for us, is if your buyers are moving from tactical to strategic, then they're viewed as a value add. If they're tactical, predominantly tactical in your business, the project teams are going to look at, hey, we got to get this in place, and then they'll just do the T's and C's and get that piece of paper placed with the supplier. If your group is viewed as strategic, they'll see the value add that you bring to the project. And again, if you can embed somebody into the project team and is involved with all the discussions, there's no handoffs or passing over the wall. I find that to be the ultimate best use of getting early involvement in strategic sourcing.
Yeah, great model, really, and embedding those sourcing professionals, those category managers with the business units, and I think, as you say, making sure that they demonstrate they're bringing something to the table. They're a strategic business partner for the business, not just there to do the tactical buy. So great perspectives there as well. So any number 5, we've sourced, we've negotiated, but now we have to get the contract in place. And again, this is sort of the point at which many organizations realize a significant potential for savings leakage. So you can do the best job of category management, strategic sourcing, but in truth, those savings at that stage are really paper savings only. They haven't matriculated to the bottom line unless you can ensure contract compliance. So once again, if we look at some of the benchmark data here, pretty significant disparity between what best-in-class companies are achieving on a couple of different dimensions. One is the percentage of spend that's actually compliant to the contract. So meaning that, number 1, you're using the preferred contracted vendor, but number 2, the pricing and terms agree with what's in the contract when you're actually paying the invoice. And as well in terms of the transaction volume. So slightly higher, about 74% of transactions contract compliant in this case. So it all says, and I think you referred to a little bit earlier, Paul, is it's not enough to have contracts in place. You have to have visibility across the organization. So I'm sure that's one of the challenges, but if you could speak to what are the challenges to ensuring contract compliance, and maybe how do you go about creating a culture of compliance?
Well, in the first inning, I talked about how we use it for the spend under management, looking at it. So again, we're looking at that awareness piece, and did we meet all the needs if something's leaking? But I say this constantly for those people that work with me, they know this. I say business is built on relationships, and that's one of the biggest challenges. If you're creating a contract that's outside of that old and true relationship, it's very hard to break that. That's one of the challenges. One of the other big challenges is if you build a contract and it's thrust on people that's just given to them to use and they didn't have any voice in its generation, adoption is going to be a lot more difficult. So it's critical to get the stakeholders involved with what you're trying to create. And that's one of the ways that we get that culture of compliance, is to try to involve the key stakeholders. Just like we don't want to be brought in late, the people that are going to end up using this product, they don't want to be brought in late either. So it's a give and take. You both have to be respectful of the other's opinion. And again, that advertising thing, as procurement, we have to be in front and embedded in our culture. One of the other ways to get this culture of compliance, and it's not necessarily one I recommend, but it would make my life a lot easier, is policy. You can force it. You must use these contracts. The only problem with that is some companies can mandate it, but it can hurt the overall company culture. So instead of feeling like it's doing the right thing, you're just being compliant. You may see a better way. So at Curtiss-Wright, we try to stimulate that innovative spirit so people have decisions. We need to provide them the best decision, and as they build confidence in what we're providing, then they do less of this trying to test what we've created for them, or if they've been involved with it, there's less opportunity for them to want to go around it. One of the other ways is just to make the corporate contracts or the agreements so easy to use that it's harder to go around them. So how can you do that? My couple of suggestions is embed the supplier in your facility with either a vendor-managed inventory or consignment. They're physically managing that inventory, and if you're doing consignment, you're actually getting a capital benefit from it, a working capital benefit, because you're not paying until you consume it, but it's there on your floor. And finally, one of the ones that we're going after right now is directly connect the person with the need with the supplier, and don't let the buyer be an enabler in between. And we want to do that with a procure-to-pay platform, which I think we're going to talk about here later in this discussion, by building catalogs in ways that they can have that Amazon.com-like experience where they don't have to go through any of the challenges that you might have to go through with raising a requisition and getting it through procurement.
Perfect. Yeah. So true, Paul. At some level, it's about making it easy for people to do the right thing, because they don't really want to be non-compliant, but in some cases our systems don't make it easy enough for them to be compliant. So great point. I want to talk in inning number 6 a little bit about suppliers. We don't have procurement without suppliers after all, but one of the big challenges here is most of our organizations have thousands or tens of thousands of suppliers. So the coordination challenge is significant. And some of the benchmark data here suggests, again, a wide disparity between what are the world-class organizations doing with regard to their supply base versus everyone else, and specifically how they rationalize and consolidate the supply base. So these benchmarks illustrate, for example, there's clearly a difference between direct and indirect suppliers. So on the direct side, it's going to be a more finite, limited group, so fewer suppliers, very closely controlled. But when it comes to indirect, there's always a vast proliferation. You know, it's a long tail spend and all those kinds of things. So lots more suppliers. But again, a clear contrast where best-in-class performers, if you look at in the aggregate, total suppliers, direct and indirect, per billion of spend, world-class organizations have about 2/3 fewer, you know, about 1,000 suppliers versus almost 6,000 for non-world-class. So again, interested in your expert opinion here, Paul. What methods do you use to determine what's the optimal size of the supply base, and what information is important for you to capture when thinking about how do I rationalize suppliers? Who are the ones that I want to keep, and which ones sort of get rationalized out?
Well, honestly, this is a very difficult question, and unfortunately, I don't have an algorithm that makes this easy where you plug in some variables and it spits out a number, but what we try to do is make it an optimization based on risk. And when I say risk, I'm referring to financial risk, but more predominantly, we're looking at the quality risk. You sometimes need multiple sources of supply in case you have an issue with either quality or delivery. And then you want to obviously give the predominance to who's giving you the best cost, but you got to balance that with other things. So when we go into a sourcing event, we may find that we have way too many suppliers, and that's one of the goals, is to come out of that with a targeted number of suppliers across the enterprise to reduce that footprint in the management of all those suppliers as well.
Great idea. Perfect. And this is our chance for the 7th inning stretch, a poll question. We're going to open it. We'll just give you 30 seconds or so. But as in the topics we've covered so far, really on the strategic procurement side, we've talked about spend analytics. We talked about sourcing and how to manage those projects, savings, contract utilization and compliance, supplier information, and performance management. So of these areas, the poll question was really, if you had to take a look at which is the one that represents the greatest need in your business for better analytics and insights that could help improve your organization's performance. So, is it spend analysis, sourcing, project management, savings tracking, contract utilization and compliance, or supplier information and performance management? So just a quick top of the mind reading here just to get some insights as to where the greatest pain point is. And second here, we'll go ahead and close the poll. I guess if I had to predict, we started with spend analytics, for a specific reason. It tends to be so foundational, it's so critical. And in this case, it did come out number one, so I'm glad I went out on a limb and took a prediction. It's better than 50%. Said, we get the biggest benefit or have the greatest need to improve spend analytics. So that tells us we started at the right point, Paul. And these other areas are of course, of concern as well. So lots of opportunity there. So again, we've been talking mainly about strategic procurement. I want to talk about operational procurement, procure to pay here for a second. I know I've been sharing a lot of data. This is a very quantitative aspect, none more so than P2P. So lots of data points here. Whether you're talking about how much of your spend in the P2P world, indirect spend, is going on catalogs versus non-catalogs, what savings are you getting through compliance, as well as lots of metrics around operational efficiency. So again, no surprise, best-in-class companies have much shorter order cycles, a day for catalog orders. The transactions are automated, so they're more frictionless, and therefore it costs them less, $4.50 per PO versus $17 for others. Invoice processing is less costly as well, almost half the amount for the average or peer group overall. So lots of data points here. Paul, as you look ahead to automating and making more efficient the operational procurement or P2P, which ones do you think are will be most important to you that you'll want to track most consistently?
Well, that was well put, because we are at the genesis of our P2P journey, but we're really focused on out of the box what KPIs are built in or baked into our business case. So we want to drive those. So we look at it too from the front end of the process to the back end of the process. So in the front end of the process, I'm looking at growing the spend through the tool. So I'm going to be monitoring how much spends in that tool to get greater engagement so that we get the greater savings. And to do that, I need to look at how many catalogs are available, how easy is it to use the tool, how much is out there for people to use the tool. So I'll be driving my team to add as many catalogs as possible, and ultimately the next metric would be spend under management through the tool. But ultimately those all add up into what I'm really after, and that's the cost savings. So that's the big piece of our business case, is the cost savings through compliance to these contracts. And mentioned earlier, you got to make it so easy that people want to use what you're doing. Procure to pay should do that for us. Now on the back end, when we're trying to settle with these suppliers, we'll be looking at invoices per FTE and the cost per invoice. And again, that working capital management is key, because you mentioned earlier, if we can expedite this process and make it basically touchless, and we can get the errors out of that process, we can take advantage of those savings that are embedded in the payment terms that we've negotiated but can't always get to in time.
Terrific. So lots of opportunity in this area for you as well. And as we're in the 7th inning stretch, our final poll here, on the topic of P2P, we just presented all these different metrics. Again, we'll just give you 30 seconds to give a quick answer here, but curious to know, is your organization more focused on the process efficiency type metrics, PO and invoice, transaction cycle times or costs, or that harder dollar savings, spend under management, how much compliance spend can you have going through your P2P process? Or is it more related to working capital management, either maximizing discount capture to reduce the spend or extending on days payable outstanding to hold on to that cash longer? Or is it more of an intangible benefit? We really want to measure end user adoption, user satisfaction, those kinds of things. So again, we'll close the poll here in a quick second and take a look. You know, I've seen in my experience, Paul, sort of a split between some folks are more focused on efficiency and others are more focused on, you know, what hard dollar savings will accrue to the bottom line. You know, and in this case, those two did come to the fore, with the hard dollar savings being predominant. You know, about you know, almost half of folks are focused there, followed closely by process efficiency, and to a lesser extent, but these are not mutually exclusive benefits, that's the good news, would be working capital management and end user adoption and satisfaction. So let's go to inning number 8, your people. So it's not just about the process or technology, it's about people too. I thought it's interesting in this benchmark from the Hackett Group that they looked at top performing procurement organizations that actually have fewer resources. On the basis of $1 billion in spend, FTEs per billion in spend, they have about 44 versus almost 60 for average performers. Not only that, it's regardless of how many FTEs you have, do you have them aligned to the more strategic activities? So a CAPS benchmark from the manufacturing industry suggests in that industry the split is about 56% to more strategic activities like sourcing or supplier management, contract management, fewer resources on the operational PO and invoice, the transaction processing side. So from your perspective, Paul, how do you assess allocation of resources, and what do you think is the optimal mix between strategic and operational?
Well, in our business being very highly decentralized, we manage that at the business unit level, and it's based on the current year projections of business. So adjustments are made to deal with that. But we do take into account the higher the complexity of the project or the product, the more supply management involvement is required to manage that, whether it be through the negotiating cycle or through the whole management of the open purchase order through conclusion to make sure you get what you need when you need it. And what is the optimal alignment of strategic versus operational? We really haven't looked at that specifically. We tend to look at it more as the shift. So we want to shift people from tactical to strategic, and we've been doing that. We're trying to build a more effective approach and try to do the right things with the right from our name in quotes there. So we're trying to automate and eliminate our tail spend, or when we do an ABC analysis of our spend, we call it the C-level spend, that small dollar stuff that's purely transactional, so that our buyers can focus where the money is. So that's how we're trying to see that shift. And we're eliminating a lot of that tactical tail spend through the use of a procurement card, which will get that off their desk, but sometimes won't drive the savings because they can go anywhere. But the other thing that we're really focused on now is procure to pay, because that'll actually funnel that through. It won't have to cross a buyer's desk, so they have more time to focus on that strategic spend. And all that value add that's put into those contracts, they're not needed to become enablers to make them happen.
Excellent. Yeah, and we had a question on this topic as well. When we look at, for instance, the Hackett Group benchmark, the question was, you know, is this both purchasing and sourcing FTEs, so operational and, you know, strategic combined? Yes, this would be total headcount FTEs in the procurement group, and you know, it's really revealing that with the efficiencies of advanced analytic tools and process automation, best-in-class performers are actually doing more with less, and overall, therefore, they're able to shift the resources that they have to more strategic activities versus transactional or tactical. So let's move into the ninth inning. Let's talk about performance. We talked a lot about how to measure your organization's performance in a very quantitative way: cycle times, savings, spend under management, contract compliance, all those things. But let's not neglect how others view your organization. So some of the techniques that very advanced or best-in-class companies are using is, first of all, to make sure they're monitoring internal stakeholder satisfaction. So you see an example here, commonly used, the Net Promoter Score, that really just from a more qualitative assessment measures, are you viewed positively? Do you have a net promoter or versus a net detractor in your organization? And then there's also the performance metrics like scorecarding that you apply to external suppliers and measure how they're performing. So on this topic, I wanted to see, Paul, could you first talk about how do you assess your organization's performance with internal stakeholders, and then how do you assess external suppliers from a performance management standpoint?
Well, first of all, internally, we've done the polls. At least the business unit that I've come from into this role, we'd actually poll the project teams and give them some Survey Monkey type poll to see how we're doing. But ultimately, we live vicariously through our suppliers. So the SMART objectives are the ones that hit the bottom line. Are we driving the numbers the way they need them? So it's the quality, the cost, the on-time delivery type things is the project being successful? Was the product delivered on time? Do we contribute to meeting or exceeding the projected margin for this project? And then we do the same, pretty much the same thing with our suppliers. So we're creating scorecards for them or report cards for them, and we're capturing that data right now through our ERP system. So it's the first time yield through receiving inspection. And when did we receive it? That's captured in the ERP, and it's compared to the contract date that's in the purchase order. And typically it varies business unit to business unit across Curtiss-Wright, but we try to do that quarterly. And automation helps. It's tough if that's done very manually. It might have to be done less frequently in the business units that don't have the benefit of capturing that in their ERP systems.
That's terrific. So it sounds like in both cases, whether it's internal stakeholders or external, you're doing a very quantitative type of analytics to measure your performance from their perspectives as well. So that's terrific. Yeah, so we're into extra innings, completed the ninth inning, and we've had a number of questions along the way. And just we'll remind you, folks who have attended here as we deal with a couple of final questions that, our purpose, our objective with this type of webinar is to share best practices and information and invaluable insights from an expert like Paul. So thanks so much, Paul, for joining today and sharing your perspectives. I think it's provided a lot of insights for our audience. And likewise, our annual conference, which is coming up later this year in the fall, it's called Horizon, is really an extension of that. It's a way to get thought leaders in the space together, to collaborate, to network, to share these best practices, approaches, because rising tide floats all boats. Everyone benefits from that type of insight. So encourage anyone who's interested. There's a special promotion you see listed here if you're interested in attending that event. And just as we go to close, a couple of questions that we didn't get a chance to address, along the way here. One of the questions actually related back to our inning on procure to pay, and was specifically, can a P2P solution actually help things like accruals? And yeah, there's definitely a use case there for accruals, because one of the things P2P gives you better visibility to, as opposed to traditional spend analytics, which is usually after the fact, that spend that's already occurred, is pipeline of spend or committed spend, based on POs that have been issued or even invoices that have been received but not yet paid. So having that visibility through a P2P tool can allow you to therefore keep the financial statements up to date, really on an automated basis, produce a report of committed spend or items invoiced not yet paid that can be accrued as expenses in the current period. So that was one of the questions. The other was presented a lot of data here. Many folks asked about getting the slides. Those will be available and distributed after the session as well. But one of the questions, too, was, are they annual figures? Yeah, things like savings, spend under management, those would be on an annual basis. And, of course, one of the objectives here is how do you keep that information current, refreshed, accurate, and up to date? And really it creates a business case, an impetus for getting these types of tools, because without them, it would be very difficult to gather this information. And the goal is not to spend time gathering data, it's using the insights from the analytics to make better decisions. So with that, I'm sure there are questions that we didn't get to. Those, send us email questions. We'll be glad to follow up or follow up with any that we didn't cover today. But I wanted to thank you, Paul, specifically for joining our discussion today and your valuable insights.
My pleasure.
And thanks to everyone for participating. You'll get the presentation, and any questions that we didn't get to, we'll try to follow up after the session with email. So thanks, everyone, for attending today.